Good morning to you all. It's fantastic to be here, and I'd like to thank Mina, Rika, Eleanor and Timor for inviting me to come along and share some thinking with you. And I really enjoyed the presentations that we've already had this morning, and hopefully the ideas I'm going to share with you will actually build on and maybe even provide some potential solutions to some of the issues that have just been raised. My area is entrepreneurship education, and I'm hopeful. How many people, just hands up, how many people are familiar with or use entrepreneurship education in your schools? So we've got a few, which is good. It's possible that some of the ideas that I'm about to share with you may seem a little bit thought-provoking, and if that's the case, don't worry too much about the fact that maybe I'm viewing things differently to the way you think. Just ask yourself why it may be that you see them as thought-provoking. I'm not suggesting I'm right in any sense, but we're certainly trying to push the envelope a little bit in trying to think about how we can actually have entrepreneurship education as part of the solutions of developing these 21st century learning competencies. And maybe one of the challenges from the outset is getting everyone to appreciate that maybe entrepreneurship isn't something that actually sits inside the curriculum. It's just something that hangs around. It's just there, but you most probably don't know it's there. And that would be, I think the perfect world outcome would be that we get to a point where no one even knows it's there. It's just the way we do things. So I want to talk about some universal processes. I want to talk about some challenges, which I think tag in quite nicely with the conversations that we've already had today. And then I want to talk about some opportunities, and I want to challenge us in the nature of the language that we're using. So, to start with, the universal processes that I want to use, I suppose, comes from my own personal background, the life that I've lived up until this point in time, and as an entrepreneur who's had good days and sad days, I tend to sort of find a connection between the process of love and the process of entrepreneurship. And I think from my perspective, it makes it very easy for me to discuss this challenge of how do we become more entrepreneurial, or how do we get an institution to actually encourage the development of entrepreneurial thought. So I'm going to run through this little analogy for you, and hopefully you can see how you think this may play out in your life. We know that in society we need both love, and we're increasingly being told that we should have initiatives at a policy level down through to the students in the classroom related to being more entrepreneurial. So it's almost like we know that both of them are required in society for society to be moving forward, but we know that both of them are not predictable, and neither of them are guaranteed for anyone. But for love, I think there are 4 things that we need to have love actually occurring. We need people being curious about each other. We need some level of passion. We certainly need trust. And we need a willingness to be vulnerable. So I'll ask you to think this one through. Now, I know some of you may have been married to someone for 40 years, but just try to remember back to the beginning point. But think about that moment when you say to someone for the first time that you love them. All right? Maybe it was someone in here did this last week. 2 people are together, and there's a point at which someone has to be the first to say, I love you. Now, at that point in time, it's quite possible that the other person may say, well, I think we'll be okay as friends, I'm not sure that I actually love you. So there's a point which we all go through where we are prepared to be vulnerable when someone actually makes that statement. Now, for some people, that may not actually happen too often in their lives. For some people, it may happen on a frequent basis. But for entrepreneurs, it happens every day. Every day that you put forward a new idea, every day that you ask somebody to believe in your visions and your ideas, you're demonstrating a willingness to be vulnerable. Now, I think most children at a very young age, they have that innate ability. They're quite happy to be vulnerable. They're not actually worried about being wrong. And of course, universally, it would seem that education systems seem to move children away from that willingness to be wrong and get them focused on always wanting to be right. And so I see exactly the same process for entrepreneurship. So if we wanted to actually have entrepreneurial thought and entrepreneurial behaviour happening in our schools, do we actually create a process, an environment where students can become curious about something? And as I'll talk to in a few minutes, something that they're interested in, not something that we want them to be curious in, but something that they have a curiosity in. People tend not to tell you to go down the street and see someone that you should fall in love with. You tend to fall in love with the people that you want to fall in love with. And likewise for entrepreneurship, we actually want people to be curious and passionate about the things that matter to them, not about things that matter to somebody else. So these are the little challenges that I'm going to sort of keep in the back of our mind as we're going through. So I think there's a universal process. I think we're all capable of being curious, passionate, trusting and vulnerable in our own lives. And it's like, can we bring that into the educational sphere to enable our students to actually experience that as well? Not just our students, but also educators and the institutions themselves. So in thinking this 21st century challenge through in terms of the skills and competencies we want people to have, we have three factors that are sort of always going to be in play. One is the students, one is the educators, and the other is the institutions that arrange the interaction between the two of these things. I think that one of the challenges with students in this current age, and I think it really picks up on a lot of the points that have been made by the previous presentations, is that we're trying to think about what's in people's hearts. What is it that gets people interested in something? Not what do we determine is the curriculum. Yes, there are a whole range of factors that we can agree on that the curriculum should actually be working through. But at what point do we allow a student to actually find a context to actually allow that curriculum to come to life? At what point do we allow someone's heart to be enrolled and not just their mind? So from my perspective over the last 10 years, I've been very interested in trying to make sense of how do we actually allow for the evolution of the habits of thought? So how do people's predetermined dispositions towards being able to cope with uncertainty, being able to take advantage of opportunities, how does that capacity actually evolve over time? And one of the very interesting things that I've sort of started thinking about is this notion of autopoiesis. So autopoiesis is this ability for something to be and become. Yeah? When a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, it's the same cell structure that's giving birth from one structure to the next. So there is a stability, there's a genetic stability that's always present through that process, even though the outcome of that process looks radically different. And I think we can bring that back to our students. What is it that we want in our students to remain stable across time whilst something else actually forms, a different capacity, a different ability to move forward? So I'm very much interested in this notion of being able to see our students as having something that is inherently stable in their development that enables them to actually give rise to new capabilities as they move forward. And this suggests that for educators, it's to what extent are the educators actually willing to play this different role? Not being the deliverer of the curriculum, not being the person charged with a particular process, but looking at each student as an individual who has their own lifeline. That we can see that the development trajectory of each student will actually differ, and we can appreciate that. And the schools that I've been off to visiting in the last few days, I can see that. I can see there's some wonderful educators here in Finland, and I can actually see why you're most probably in some of these areas, because there actually is an appreciation of the individual student. And, trying to actually unscramble the egg and try to make sense of how do we actually fix the Finnish system, it looks actually pretty good from where I sit. So I wouldn't be too worried. I think the challenge is we're all facing a dilemma. It's not just Finland, it's every country in the world. Ted picked up on it very well. And you guys also sort of drew it. We're actually facing a different type of student, and the different type of student is actually entering a different type of world. So the changes that we need within our systems are more around those areas. And then institutions, to what extent can an institution genuinely say that it provides an environment where the teacher trusts the student trusts the educator trusts the parents trust and so on and so on. So it's a big challenge, it's not just an easy fix to work through this process. And it's challenging because we know from the work of Beard that there are millions and millions of permutations of possible ways that we can actually organise the way in which learning happens. And especially from an entrepreneurial perspective, we're talking about experiential learning. And you can see from the range of different factors that can be altered here, from the nature of the learning environment, the activities we use, the way people communicate and sense in that environment, the emotions that we're allowed to be used, the stimulations which we're actually using, and the nature of change that we're actually trying to achieve. There are so many different permutations that can actually occur in any one place. So it's not about converging towards a great way of doing things, it's actually about diverging and finding all those different ways that we can be effective in helping all these different types of students. So, first challenge that we face. We're all faced with the fact that we are now inheriting a generation of students into our schools who actually learn differently. We're inheriting a situation which Ted picked up on very well, that the jobs of the past are disappearing. So there has to be a purpose for the education. There has to be a reason why the students are coming before us. There's got to be a purpose for us. How are we actually helping these students? What actually is the journey that we're helping them on? Now, the work of David Price, which Mina alluded to earlier, he talks about this notion that by 2020, so that's just around the corner, by 2020, we could be looking at 50% of all work being done by freelancers. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of people disagreeing with this notion that the architecture professional won't be working in a large firm. And indeed, if we look at the diagram that you guys had up there about the remote work and these other issues, it seems to make sense. So given that someone may not want to actually bring someone into an organisation and train them through that process, how do we actually prepare students to be able to sell their value and to compete in a market where they're actually tendering themselves against other people globally for the skills and abilities that they actually have? On Christmas Day this year, my daughter, Tulakan, who's 8 years old, she decided that she would play Happy Birthday on the keyboard. I didn't actually realise she could play the keyboard, and as it turns out, she couldn't. But the keyboard had A, B, C, D and E written on the keys, and she got out her iPad, she searched how to play Happy Birthday, she found the keys, and she practiced it, and within 5 minutes, she was doing it. So she didn't have to go to the music lesson, she was quite happy just to work it out for herself. And that really is the type of student that we're working with. Whether or not we're giving the students the technology in the classroom and whether or not we're using the technology wisely in the classroom most probably matters a lot less than the fact that the students actually have access to that technology in their own homes and they're actually able to learn about the things they want to learn at a time and place of their choosing. And they're most probably already ahead of us in a lot of respects in terms of how they're actually making that learning happen. So I won't run through all of these particular things in any great detail, but David Price sees this new style of learning that this younger generation who's coming through, who are in our classes right now, they want to be able to do it themselves. They want to be able to do it when it pleases them. They're quite happy to do it collegially and actually share that learning online. They're very happy to actually help other people, to actually understand how that process may unfold for them. They want to have fun while they're actually doing this process, and they're very happy for it to be highly visible, to share it on Facebook and other such places where everyone else can actually see what it is they're doing on their blog and in these other areas. The second challenge that we face is that educators and students naturally view the world constrained by the material reality of that world. The world we experience is very hard for you to understand what a classroom in Tasmania looks like. Because if you haven't been there, well, then you haven't experienced it. I have an inkling now of what happens in some Finnish classes because I've stepped in to some classrooms and I've seen some students and I've talked to some educators. And so I have now an inkling. Clearly I haven't seen enough to actually be able to say, I think I know how it all works, but at least I have an inkling now of how things may differ or be the same. And that's really important. Where it really gets tricky is because the issues that the guys here have just spoken about suggest that there's a capacity required by our students to be able to understand a much broader and complex world if they're actually to participate in it. We don't actually inherit this sensory ability. It's not something we do. There are a lot of other things in the world that do. Spiders don't go to spider school. They don't learn how to build a web. It's an instinctive thing that they know. Those starlings that you can see up on the right-hand side of the picture here, you can have thousands, as I'm sure you've seen, thousands and thousands of starlings flying around in this mass. There is no leader. There is no one bird leading that process. They fly roughly about 2 inches apart from each other, and yet they never hit each other. Have you ever wondered how that's possible? How could it actually be that these masses of birds can just fly around and never hit each other? But they've inherited an instinctive set of rules, of local rules, that says when something's there, you move this way. And they all just abide by these inherited genetic rules that enable them to move backwards and forwards. Just like these ants know how to get home or how to actually follow the fact that someone's found something when they follow that pheromone trail. Most things in the world on this planet have inherited a set of sensory abilities that enable them to survive. But we don't, as learners and people trying to make sense of the environment we live in, and the environment that our students here in Finland are actually trying to make sense of is not just Finland. It's Europe and it's the entire world. I have some students that I'm going to be working with back in Tasmania, and we want those students in primary schools around age 9 and 10. We want them to start writing stories. We want them to write books, but we want them to write something that they can publish on Amazon. We want them to see themselves as somebody who can create content that can actually be sold to the world. We want to see these children have an opportunity to recognise themselves as authors. Because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very hard for a student to decide to become an author. Because they'd have to find an agent, they'd have to find a publisher, and chances are someone would keep saying no to them. Like J.K. Rowling's got 27 no's for Harry Potter, right? What chance has a kid got with a short story of getting a yes? Now there is no gatekeepers. They can write the story, make sure it actually works the way they want it to, they can upload it, and it's on sale to the rest of the world for that feedback the next day. No one's going to say you can or you can't. The world is there for them. They can jump in and participate in it. In terms of entrepreneurship education, one of the real challenges that we face is an ongoing debate between, is it directed at developing a mindset, or is it about actually getting someone prepared to be able to move forward and start a business? My take on this has changed quite a lot in the last year. And from my perspective, it's 100% started by understanding what's in a student's heart. If we can ask what's in the student's heart, then we have the best place to start. Because now we've found something that they're curious about, that there's a passion for, and if we can actually help them to understand that there's a trusting environment that they can explore that in, and then it's okay for them to fail, as we talked about before, about these different types of bold experimentations in that process, then we don't have to worry about the end outcome. We don't need to worry about, did they succeed? Do they understand the journeys that they're taking? Every time they want to explore an idea, every time they want to actually be vulnerable to the world and say, I'm interested in your world, are you interested in me? And have that confidence to know when to actually walk away from that world and go back to that world. That's the type of skill sets that I believe are inherently picked up in all of the 21st century skills. It relates to all of them. And that's why entrepreneurship education is a really hard subject area, so to speak, to place, because it just seems to be like the potential magic dust that can be spread across so many different areas in the curriculum. It's not really a competing component, but a very much an enabling component. So the third challenge that I see is that we are sort of stuck with a language which, I don't like. And I'm very curious to see during our discussion whether or not I can change some of your thinking here, or whether you're already in this space, already having these thoughts. But I think we're stuck in a world today where we've got this ODGI paradox. And I find myself always having to try to sort of pull myself out of this space and then have to explain the way I'm thinking. So we have this pedagogy box, and it's almost like everything fits in it. It's an open-ended box that accommodates all things related to teaching practice. It doesn't matter what we talk about, it's pedagogical, right? Everything we talk about with our teaching practice is pedagogical. We just put it into the box, but it's almost like there's no real parameter to this thing. The box lid stays open because we don't really count things in and count things out. It's just this endless box that we put things into. And I think this is a real problem. We're starting to tackle it now in entrepreneurship education because we want to start with the heart. And the heart that we want to start with is the student's heart, not the educator's heart, the student's heart. So this creates a bit of a dilemma. I think we can get around that dilemma by actually having a different series of boxes. And now we can actually put a lid on the boxes. Because now we can actually say, and I know you might be thinking, pedagogy, where's this word coming from? Even worse still, academagogy. It sounds like he's making all these words up. There actually is a literature on this, so you can go and check that out. It's actually a really cool literature, and I'll discuss that as we go through here. But now we can actually have this process. We're closing the box. We actually have this emancipatory process now. We're actually free to think about specifically what does the educator initiate. Because what the educator does and arranges and makes decisions about, that's pedagogical. We do tend to use the word as meaning something to do with children, and that's fine, but ultimately you can have a pedagogical approach with adults, you can have it with senior citizens, you can have it with anyone. If it's when the educator is making the decisions about what's going to be studied, how it's going to be studied, how it'll be tested, how it'll be assessed, how the feedback will occur, when it will actually happen, the environment that it'll happen in, that's a pedagogical approach. Alternatively, we can have a pedagogical approach. So pedagogy is self-determined learning. So now we're interested in what it is that the student initiates. So now we're actually asking the student, why don't you tell me what you want to do? Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to do this across an entire curriculum. I'm just talking about those spaces. We might be that Tuesday where we actually say to people, hey, off you go and have your fun. And we don't want to tell you what fun you're going to have. You're going to actually tell us where you want to have your fun and what it actually is that you want to do. So now we actually have a starting point that's authentic around the hearts and the passions and the curiosity of the student themselves. And in between, we can see andragogy as not just being about adult learning, but it's really about where those responsibilities are being shared. It's where we've got a student that's self-directed, whether they're 8 years old or whether they're 18 years old or whether they're 80 years old. It's where we've actually got that self-directed learning that's being done in partnership with. And I'll come back to, well, it's all right, I've got it on this slide anyway, so it's fine. So how this looks like for entrepreneurship education, so this wouldn't be exactly the case for all of your teaching context, but how it sort of looks is that we have a situation where we sort of say, well, you know what, at some point in the beginning, and it's iterative, this process is not sequential, so we can start at the other end, we can start at the beginning end, but initially when we're dealing with people in the entrepreneurship space, we want them to be curious, we want them to thinking about that process, and that may require us to have a more pedagogical approach in that we're actually structuring and scaffolding that process as it goes through. But ultimately what we'd like them to move towards is actually being able to become more confident about learning through the process of actual experiential education. You can see up in the top right-hand corner, the outcome that we're actually trying to achieve is that we want to be able to have a student who's capable of self-negotiated action. Now, my argument for you would be, without putting a label on entrepreneurship education in any of your curriculums, that isn't that what you all want? For every student that we have in our care, wouldn't we want every one of our students, for whatever the subject area might be, to be capable of self-negotiated action? That they could actually take that responsibility on themselves? Given that this world where they may have to actually go off and actually make the running on their own freelancer career, where they're actually looking way beyond the economy of Finland to actually earn that income. It's not that straightforward, and the real challenge that we have, of course, is that how do we get educators to play this role, and that is academagogy. Academagogy is scholarly leading. So it's your ability to be able to move between these three boxes, where we're sort of saying, well, I get at this day, given who you are, I can see that Tina is actually really capable of being able to say, that's where I want to start. I was thinking about this over the weekend and I want to do something about building a website. Fantastic. Her starting point. Now, as an educator, my challenge is, okay, is there some form of content, some other information that I can actually bring to bear? So I can offer my pedagogical assistance to that pedagogical starting point, and we can actually arrange. I mean, with my students back home, I'll ask them, what are you interested in and how do you want to make a difference in that space? And that may be the starting point for their project. The next question would be, how are we going to assess that? What do you think? In Australia we have a distinction, a high distinction, a distinction, a credit, a pass and a failure. So I will ask that student in that situation, well, given that that's what you want to do and this is the impact you want to have in that space, how would we assess that outcome? And it's up to them to actually work out, well, I think if I can achieve these outcomes, that should be a high distinction. And we have a negotiated process. So we're in this andragogical space where we're actually working out what we both think is a fair thing. So I'll keep moving through the slides because we've only got a few minutes left. But this is an idea which we've been working with now. The students love it. The reason they love it is because it's easy to explain to them. Because now we're not telling them about what we're going to do, we're actually saying explicitly what we see you as having the opportunity and the responsibility to do. And if you want to be in the classroom, bring your heart. It's not just a space for minds, bring your heart and let's actually see how this can roll forward. I think this is so important for us because picking back up on Mina's slide from the very first presentation, we're all being asked to do something in this space. There is a different set of skills that students are going to need. It's about their ability to understand the world around them, to use information in a range of different ways. In Australia, ours looks like that. It's not really that much different. We call these the 21st century fluencies. So a slightly different take on it, but I'm sure Mina could most probably go around this one and connect up the dots like she did in the previous diagram she had. So globally, we're all being asked to create a different type of student, one that's self-motivated, one that has that capacity to deal with change. So I suspect that there is something about letting our students off the leash a little bit more that can work for us all. So I'll go through this slide fairly quickly. I like this statement by Tyler. He says that education is the process of changing behavioural patterns of people. That is, using behaviour in the broad sense to include thinking, feeling, as well as overt action. In my classroom, it works this way. We try to create relational trust. We want everybody to be able to trust everybody. We want to be able to see that the educator's role is going to change as I interact with my student. And that my interaction between myself and my institution will change as that process occurs as well, as change happens there. But if we all trust each other and we all understand each other, then this can actually be a very profitable space. But the key thing, the most important thing for this process is vulnerability. Am I prepared to be vulnerable to my students? Am I prepared to be vulnerable to my institution? Are the students prepared to be vulnerable to me? Once we have vulnerability as that sort of midpoint, something that actually sits between us, anything is possible. But when you take that away, when you don't trust me and I don't trust you, well then you just do your job and I'll just do the best I can. And we know where that's going to lead to. So in terms of how should an entrepreneurship educator act, if you're thinking about what you do and what you might be looking to do in your school, I love this picture because I just think it captures, I was looking for an image and I think it captures what an entrepreneurship educator should look like. The student knows they're there, they can see their shadow, but that's about it, right? They're on call, right? They're at the other pedagogical end waiting to find out actually what's going to happen over in this space. John Ruskin, the educational philosopher from the last century, he thought that there were three things that any educator should be doing. He should make sure that students understand where he or she is. They should work out where he or she is going. And if you know that, then the challenge would be, what does he or she best do under those circumstances. That's our challenge. Everybody's on a journey. They're all not moving to do the SAT tests that people were doing years ago. They've got to make the running. They've got to create an opportunity for themselves in this increasingly complex but increasingly opportunistic environment that they're actually moving into. So what principles should guide? These are pedagogical principles that actually come through. Well, I'll go back one. I think I love this saying. I just think it captures where it is we actually start. Start where you are, and use what you have and do what you can after Ash. I think that just captures it, because we don't need to worry about how someone's going to connect to our curriculum challenges and the process that we want of them. We just want to ask these kids, well, what's in your heart? What are you interested in? What do you want to do? And use that as our starting point. Then we can apply these principles of pedagogy. And this comes from a fantastic book that Hayes and Cannon have actually written about this when they've brought all their ideas together. And I'll just quickly run through them without explaining them. And self-audit yourself. Ask yourself, to what extent do you think that these things already apply in your context? Because a lot of the time when I talk to people about pedagogy, what I actually find is they're already doing it. They just didn't have a name for it. So sometimes it's just a matter of retrofitting and being able to explain your behaviour using a different language. So learning when the learner is ready. Learner requires more than knowledge and skills. It requires the learner to make new connections to the world that they're around. Learning doesn't depend upon the teacher. It can be triggered by experiences. So the kids can learn on Saturday and Sunday too when they're not at school, right? Because they're interacting with a world, and that can be just as meaningful for them. Learning is focused upon the student, not on the curriculum. Self-sufficiency in learning, personal exploration and risk-taking is what we're actually trying to pursue. The ability to change one's way of thinking from acting and learning, so that deep reflection. The application of the learning, so not just learning it for a test, but actually learning something that they can apply, so being able to develop that wisdom and being able to have those positive learning values so that they see the process as being fun. So the challenges that we face is that we're currently being asked to do something quite magical in this space. Entrepreneurship education is assumed to be a key, a solution to a whole range of problems and challenges that we face. We're not miracle workers, so the most important thing is that we need to make sure we don't overpromise what we can do. We don't know what's going to happen at our students' graduation, and either do they, and we can't really know with any great confidence going forward. The location is such an important thing for our students, and most of our students mostly won't learn the big things they need to inside our classrooms. I know it's difficult here when you've got snow piled up outside, but we really should kick the students out and tell them to go out and actually interact with the real world. And lastly, we need to remember what type of business that we're actually in when we're actually talking about entrepreneurship education. We're about creating things that currently don't exist. Lots of other business forms of education are dealing with the maintenance of that does exist. It's a very predictable science, right? But entrepreneurship education, we're dealing with things that haven't even been invented, that haven't even been thought of. So it's a very, very unpredictable space that we're trying to get students to become comfortable in. I love this saying, if you're a troublemaker like I am, entrepreneurship is the last refuge of the troublemaking individual. It's a great saying because at the end of the day, when you're trying to get people to do things that actually haven't been done yet and people can't comprehend, think of Jeff Bezos when he started Amazon.com, right? 1992, he's out there and he's thinking about, I'm going to have an online bookstore. There was about a dozen people who'd tried it before at a lower level, had failed. So how would his market research have gone? I'm going to go and talk to 1,000 people and ask them, do they want to buy a book online? Can you remember when you first used the word online? Was it 1992 or was it 1995? There's a challenge for people who actually have that driven conviction to create something that doesn't even exist. It doesn't even exist in the imaginations of people. I think we're on the second last slide. I read through this statement recently and I loved it. It's from a book called The Human Condition. You may have come across it by Charles Hoffer. And he says, the central task of education is to implant a will and facility for learning. It should produce not learned, but learning people. The truly human society is a learning society where grandparents, parents and children are students together. It is in a time of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. It is the malady of our age that the young are so busy teaching us that they have no time left to learn. And I think there's a real challenge in there for us. Our students, from primary school kids to high school kids, they are super, super capable of learning about this world that we find complex, because they've already mastered their iPad and Google and Wikipedia and all the other things that they need to navigate it. They rely on it, in second nature. So we have a couple of choices. We can either, as educators, continue to remain in control. We decide what's in the curriculum, we decide how they'll engage with it, and we'll make all of those decisions on behalf of the students. We could let them off the leash a little bit and require them to become that self-directed type of learner, Or we could actually accept that part of our role is to become their support staff. That we're there to support their journey, their individual passions, their dreams, and the things that they choose to be vulnerable to. If we want to be able to move across that spectrum, then we need to embrace this notion of academagogy. Academagogy is the highest role that we as educators can play, because it's the scholarly leading that we provide in an environment where we understand what our responsibilities are relative to the curriculum outcomes that are set at a national level, but we also understand how the individual students differ and how we can help them to be motivated learners and to pursue the things that they want, for them to be able to develop an uncommon interest in the commonplace by being able to actually apply their learning to the very world that they live in. And I think that brings us to the end. Thank you very much.